Hey guys, tonight we are trading the mud and misery of the poor for something far shinier. The lives of the filthy rich in ancient Greece. Not the marble statue, wise philosopher, noble democracy version you got in school. I mean the real thing, where your comfort was built entirely on other people's backs, your wine was watered down, and a good night out meant lying on a couch until you fell off it. Before we begin, a genuine thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's journey. Your ideas really do shape everything I make here, and this channel simply would not grow without them. If you enjoy what I do, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this, no pressure at all. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you, because somehow it is always 2 a.m. somewhere. The channel is also now live on Spotify, so if you would rather drift off with just your ears, the link is waiting for you in the description. And if you really cannot get enough, there is a standalone 8-hour ad-free video ready for members whenever you want to sink into an entire night of history. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise and get comfortable. Let us wonder for a moment. Did rich Greeks actually bathe, or did they just smother themselves in olive oil and call it hygiene? Did they really eat lying down, and if so, how did anyone avoid wearing their own dinner? What did you even do all day if you never had to work and enslaved people handled everything down to lacing your sandals? Could you survive a proper Greek drinking party without starting a philosophical argument or falling face first into a fountain? And would you last a single afternoon as an Athenian aristocrat? Or would you accidentally insult a god, a general, and your own mother-in-law all before lunch? Well, congratulations. You've just woken up in Athens 440 BCE at the glittering height of its golden age. You own a fine house, a great many enslaved people, and absolutely no idea how lucky and how doomed you actually are. Good luck. Congratulations, you're rich, you are Greek, and it is barely past dawn. The bad news is that even the wealthy did not sleep on anything you would recognize as a mattress. Your bed is a wooden frame strung with leather cords and topped with a wool-stuffed pad, which is a genuine upgrade from a peasant's pile of straw, but only in the way that a park bench is an upgrade from the floor. Your grand house is built around an open central courtyard, cool and airy and entirely without the concept of a hallway. There is no glass in the windows, no chimney, and not much privacy, but there is a great deal of marble, and honestly, that is rather the whole point. You're awake now, so someone enslaved is already on their way with water. Welcome to the good life. Your house, by the standards of the day, is genuinely impressive, which is to say it is a windowless box wrapped lovingly around a hole in the middle. That hole is the courtyard, the beating heart of the home, open to the sky and ringed with columns, and every room worth having faces inward toward it rather than outward toward the street. This was partly for privacy, partly for security, and partly because facing the street meant facing the smell, which we will get to later whether you like it or not. Light spills in from above, air drifts in from above, and on a wet morning, so does a fair amount of the actual weather, straight onto your lovely floor. The walls themselves are mostly sun-dried mud brick sitting on a stone footing, which sounds sturdy until you learn that Athenian burglars were sometimes called wall diggers, because breaking into a home did not mean picking a lock, it meant tunnelling straight through the side of the house. Your marble is largely decorative. Your security is largely optimism. Inside, the finest room in the entire building is the andron, the men's dining room, where you will host your drinking parties later tonight. It is decorated, it is proud, and its doorway is deliberately set off-centre, so the couches can line the walls without interruption. The rest of the ground floor is working space, a kitchen with an open hearth, storerooms heavy with oil and grain and wine, and quarters for the enslaved staff. Upstairs, tucked away from visitors, are the women's rooms. Furniture is sparse everywhere. A few couches, some stools, a low 3-legged table, and wooden chests, because the closet has not been invented and will not be for a very long time. There is no plumbing, so your waste lives in a pot until someone carries it outside and adds it generously to the street. Light after dark comes from small olive oil lamps that flicker, smoke, and produce roughly the glow of a single sad candle. Warmth comes from portable braziers of hot coals, which you shuffle from room to room like a cat chasing a sunbeam. And all around you, quietly, the house is already alive. Water is being drawn, bread is being kneaded, the courtyard is being swept before you have so much as sat upright. Your entire morning, your comfort, your calm, your leisure arrives fully assembled as if by magic. Except, of course, it is not magic at all. It is people, and they are worth meeting properly. Let us address the elephant in the beautifully decorated room. Every single comfort you're about to enjoy today rests entirely on the labour of enslaved people, and there are a lot of them. A wealthy Athenian household might own a dozen or more human beings, and the city itself ran on tens of thousands. They cook your food, weave your clothes, walk your children to school, and quietly keep the whole operation from collapsing while you take full credit for its elegance. To you this feels as ordinary as electricity feels to us, which is precisely the uncomfortable part. You will spend your entire day being admired for your leisure, your learning, and your refinement, none of which would survive a single afternoon without the people you have trained yourself not to see. Where did they all come from? Everywhere, and none of it gentle. Some were captured in war, marched home as the human spoils of a victory. Some were seized by pirates and sold at market like sacks of grain. Some were bought from traders who moved people across the sea alongside wine and pottery. And many were simply born into it, because the child of an enslaved woman belonged by law to her owner from its very first breath. There was no ladder out of that by default. There was only the faint, rare hope of one day being freed. Their lives varied enormously, and this is where it gets genuinely grim. If you were a household slave in a rich home, your days were hard but survivable. You cooked, cleaned, hauled water, minded the children, and worked the loom, close enough to the family to be almost, but never quite, part of it. Some skilled enslaved craftsmen even lived semi-independently, running workshops and handing over most of their earnings to their owner, which was considered a rather good arrangement, mostly by the owner. But if you were sent down to the silver mines, you entered a short, brutal existence in cramped tunnels that few walked out of. Same city, same laws, wildly different sentence. In the eyes of Athenian law, an enslaved person was property, plain and simple. You could be bought, sold, gifted, or gambled away. You could not legally marry, own yourself, or refuse a command. Punishment was physical and expected, and in one of the coldest details the ancient courts have to offer, the testimony of an enslaved person was only accepted as evidence if it had been extracted under torture, because free men were trusted to lie politely, while the unfree were assumed to tell the truth only in pain. It is hard to read, and it should be. Yet the strangest part for you is how invisible all of this feels from the inside. The enslaved woman who nursed you as a baby, the pedagogos who walked you to your lessons and swatted you when you slouched, the cook whose skill makes your name at dinner parties, all of them shaped your life more intimately than most of your relatives, and all of them could be sold tomorrow without a word of warning. You will drink your watered wine tonight and toast your own good fortune, your good taste, your good breeding, and every drop of that comfort was carried to you, warmed for you, and cleaned up after by someone who received nothing for it but the chance to do it again the next day. But enough uncomfortable truth for one morning. You have a body to attend to, and in ancient Greece, That turns out to be far stranger than it sounds. It is time to freshen up, and here is where ancient luxury takes a distinctly strange turn. Soap, as you understand it, simply does not exist. Instead, you slather yourself in olive oil, let it mingle with the dust and sweat of the previous day, and then scrape the whole slurry off with a curved metal tool called a strigil. Yes, you are essentially squeegeeing your own body like a windshield after a long drive. The oil was expensive, perfumed, and considered the very height of sophistication, which meant the richer you were, the more elaborately you got to remove your own filth. It sounds absurd, and it was, but your skin stayed soft and you smelled faintly of a warm salad, which in ancient Athens counted as smelling absolutely fantastic. Olive oil, you must understand, was not merely a cooking ingredient here. It was the single most versatile substance in your entire life. It was your moisturizer, your cleanser, your sunscreen, your lamp fuel, and the base for every perfume you owned. Whole fortunes were built on it. Whole wars were fought near it, and whole gods were thanked for it. When Athena and Poseidon competed for the city, the story goes, she won by giving the people the olive tree, which tells you exactly how seriously these people took their oil. For the wealthy, the real flex was scent. You did not just oil yourself, you oiled yourself with fragrance, kept in small round flasks and mixed with rose, iris, marjoram or myrrh. A truly stylish man might wear a different perfume on different parts of his body, which even other Greeks found a bit much. The moralists grumbled that this was decadent, unmanly, and vaguely embarrassing. The rich naturally ignored them and bought more. Then there was your hair, which followed the fashion with the strictness of a dress code. A grown Athenian man of good standing kept a proper beard, always, because a bare face marked you as either a boy or a foreigner, and shaving the whole thing off was not yet the done thing. Your hair was kept short and neat, since long flowing locks were seen as the affectation of an old-fashioned aristocrat, or, worse, a Spartan. For the women of the house it was the opposite. Hair was grown long, oiled, curled, braided, pinned up, and arranged into architecture, all of it done indoors and all of it done by enslaved hands. Now for the part everyone would rather skip, the teeth. There is no toothbrush, no toothpaste, and no dentist worth the name. The best you can do is rinse, rub your teeth with a cloth, and perhaps chew something to freshen your breath, which was almost always fighting a losing battle. Bad breath was so common that it was simply background noise, a fact of every conversation, every whisper, every romantic moment. You will smell of expensive perfume from the neck down, and of last night's wine from the mouth out, and nobody will find this remotely strange. As for washing properly, you have basins of water at home and cold public facilities in the city, but hot bathing was a rare treat, not a daily habit. Mostly it is the oil and the scraping over and over, the ancient world's answer to a hot shower. So you rise gleaming and fragrant and freshly squeegeed, ready to face the day looking your absolute best. Which means, of course, that it is time to get dressed. And Greek clothing, it turns out, is its own small adventure. Now for the wardrobe, and I hope you enjoy folding, because Greek clothing was essentially one very large rectangle and a great deal of confidence. Your basic garment is the chiton, a length of linen or fine wool pinned at the shoulders and belted at the waist, with no buttons, no meaningful stitching, and no forgiveness whatsoever if it slips. Over that you drape the himation, an even larger rectangle you must arrange just so, because a gentleman who wore his cloak sloppily was mocked as thoroughly as a modern man showing up to the office in a bathrobe. The fabric was fine, the dyes were costly, and the overall look said wealth and taste. It also said one strong sea breeze away from a very public problem. The genius of Greek dress, if you want to be generous, is that it fit everyone and required no tailoring at all. The same rectangle worked whether you gained weight, lost weight, or grew a foot taller, which is more than can be said for anything hanging in a modern closet. The catch is that keeping it all in place depended entirely on pins, brooches, and a firm belt. Lose a pin at the wrong moment and your dignity went with it. Those pins, by the way, once caused a genuine scandal. According to an old story the Athenians told, a mob of women once turned on a man who brought bad news and stabbed him to death with the long pins that fastened their dresses. The horrified city responded not by rethinking anything important, but by changing the women's fashion so the dangerous pins were phased out. It is a very Athenian solution. When in doubt, restrict the women and keep the messenger. Colour was where your money truly showed. Most ordinary clothing was left the natural off-white of undyed wool, or a dull brown, because good dye was hideously expensive. The king of all colours was a deep reddish purple, squeezed in tiny amounts from thousands of murex sea snails through a process so smelly and laborious that the finished cloth cost more than gold by weight. To wear purple was to wear a small fortune draped across your shoulders, and everyone in the room knew exactly what it meant. There were variations for different lives. Working men and enslaved labourers wore the exomis, a short, practical garment pinned at only one shoulder that left the other arm bare for hard work. Young men, riders and travellers favoured a short cloak called the chlamys, which was easier to move in and far less likely to trip you at a gallop. But for a wealthy man of leisure like you, the full-length himation was the statement piece, and wearing it correctly was practically a competitive sport. The rules were unwritten but merciless. The cloth should fall in graceful folds. Your left arm stayed wrapped and tucked, your right arm free. The hem should never drag in the muck, never ride up too high, never be flung about carelessly. A man who mastered the himation looked calm, controlled, and effortlessly superior. A man who fumbled it looked like he was fighting a tent in a windstorm, and the whole point of your life is to be the first man, never the second. Underwear, in case you were wondering, was largely optional and largely absent. You are, for the most part, one elegant rectangle away from the elements. So you stand there, draped, pinned, perfumed, and quietly terrified of a stiff breeze, dressed like the wealthy citizen you are. And now, properly clothed, you can finally sit down to the first meal of the day, which is going to disappoint you enormously. Breakfast has arrived, and you may want to lower your expectations quickly, because even the filthy rich began the day with almost nothing. The morning meal, the akratisma, was usually just a piece of barley bread dipped in a little undiluted wine, perhaps with a few olives or figs if you were feeling wildly indulgent. That is genuinely it. No eggs, no honeyed feast, no attendant fanning you with grapes while you recline. The Greeks simply did not believe in a large breakfast, rich or poor, and treated the whole affair as a minor inconvenience between sleeping and getting on with the day. So you dunk your bread, sip your wine at an hour that would deeply alarm your doctor, and console yourself with the fact that at least the bread is very good bread. To make sense of this, you have to understand how the Greeks divided up their eating. The day held 3 meals, and the morning one was by far the least important. There was the akratisma at dawn, a small, functional thing. There was the ariston around midday, a light lunch you will meet a little later. And then there was the dipnon in the evening, the real meal, the social meal, the one that mattered. Breakfast, in this scheme, was the meal you had simply to stop yourself from fainting before lunch. The bread itself came in 2 grades, and your wealth showed even here. Most people ate maza, a coarse barley bread or paste that was cheap, filling, and about as exciting as it sounds. The finer option was artos, a proper wheat bread, lighter and softer, and considerably more expensive, which meant it landed on the tables of people like you far more often than on anyone else's. You're eating the good loaf while most of the city gnaws the plain one. And this, more than anything you say or wear, is what being rich actually feels like day to day. The wine at this hour deserves a mention, because to modern ears, wine with breakfast sounds like the beginning of a very sad story. But the Greeks drank wine the way we drink water, coffee and juice combined, from morning to night, at every age and every meal. It was safer than much of the available water, it was cheerful, and it was simply what you did. The only unusual thing here is that your dawn wine might be taken neat, undiluted, because at breakfast the elaborate rules about mixing had not yet kicked in for the day. Do not get used to it. Later, drinking it straight will mark you as a barbarian. Alongside the bread and wine, you might have a handful of olives, a few figs fresh or dried, a bit of cheese, perhaps some honey if the household kept bees or could afford to buy it. Fruit in season, when it came, was a small delight. But nothing here was designed to be a feast. The Greeks admired restraint at the table, at least out loud, and considered a man who ate heavily in the morning to be soft, greedy, or both. There is something almost charming in it. The wealthiest man in the neighbourhood, draped in perfumed cloth, waited on by a dozen people, sitting down to a hard piece of bread and a splash of wine like a student who overslept. Luxury, in ancient Greece, was rarely about piling your plate high. It was about who cooked, who served, and who got to lounge while others laboured. And speaking of who is lounging where, there is a whole part of your own home you've been quietly ignoring, and it is time we looked at it. Before you stride out into your glorious day of leisure, let us take a quiet look at the part of your own home you will barely set foot in, the women's quarters, or gynoeceum. In a wealthy Greek house, respectable women lived largely separate from the men, usually in rooms set toward the back or on the upper floor, well away from the front door in the eyes of any visitors. This was not officially framed as a prison, though the practical difference was mostly a matter of vocabulary. Here your wife, your daughters, and the enslaved women spun wool, ran the household, and lived a life spent almost entirely indoors. You, meanwhile, will spend your day in the sunshine at the gym and at the market, occasionally wondering aloud why the women of the house always seem so quiet. The logic behind all of this, as your society explained it, was protection and honour. A respectable woman was meant to be shielded from the eyes of strange men, kept safe, kept pure, and above all kept from becoming a subject of gossip. There was a saying admired by the men of Athens that the most virtuous woman was the one least talked about, whether in praise or in blame. The ideal woman, in other words, was one the city barely knew existed. It is a chilling sort of compliment when you sit with it. In practice, this meant the household was quietly split in two. The andron, the fine dining room, was the man stage, the place where you entertained, argued, and drank the night away with other men. The gynoeceum was the woman's world, the place where the actual machinery of the home turned. A well-behaved wife didn't wander into your dinner parties, and a well-behaved guest did not go looking for her. The house had a public face and a private one, and the women lived their entire lives on the private side of that line. Leaving the house at all was a carefully managed affair. When a respectable woman did go out, she went veiled, modestly dressed, and accompanied, never simply strolling about on a whim. The legitimate reasons to be seen in public were limited and mostly sacred: religious festivals, funerals, family occasions, and the great civic rituals where women played essential roles. These were real and important outings, not mere errands, which is part of why festivals mattered so much to the women of the city. For many of them, the festival calendar was one of the few doors to the outside world. Here is the detail that reveals the whole system for what it was. This kind of seclusion was itself a luxury. Poorer women could not possibly stay indoors all day, because someone had to sell goods in the market, fetch water from the public fountain, work in the fields, and earn a living. Their lives were spent very much in public, out of sheer necessity. So the ability to keep your women hidden away, doing nothing that the world could see, was a way of announcing that your household was rich enough not to need their visible labour. Confinement, dressed up as virtue, was a status symbol. It is worth remembering too that not all Greeks lived this way. Away in Sparta, women exercised in the open, owned property, spoke their minds, and moved through public life with a freedom that scandalized conservative Athenians, who muttered about it constantly. The Gyneceum was an Athenian obsession, not a universal Greek one, which makes it all the harder to defend as simple common sense. So the women of your house wait upstairs, spinning and managing and enduring, while you head out to enjoy the city, and it would be very easy to assume they do nothing of importance up there. That assumption would be a catastrophic mistake. It is tempting to assume that in a world this lopsided, the woman of the house did essentially nothing. That assumption would have your household bankrupt within a month. Your wife was, in practice, the manager of the entire domestic economy, the oikos, and it was a serious operation. She directed the enslaved staff, oversaw the food stores, supervised the weaving that clothed everyone, and kept the accounts that kept you solvent, all while receiving essentially none of the credit and none of the freedom. Greek writers praised the ideal wife as one who was rarely seen and rarely heard, which is a remarkable way to describe the person quietly running the whole institution. You get the banquets, the philosophy, and the applause. She gets the spreadsheet and the silence. The Greeks actually wrote instruction manuals on this, and they are wonderfully revealing. In one famous account, a wealthy husband describes training his very young wife to run the home the way a general trains an army. He teaches her where everything is stored, how to assign tasks, how to keep supplies in order, and how to nurse the household back to health when someone falls ill. He compares her, approvingly, to the queen bee of a hive, sitting at the centre, while the workers come and go at her direction. It is meant as high praise. It also quietly admits that without her, the entire hive collapses. Consider what actually fell to her. The food that came in from your estates and the market had to be sorted, stored and rationed across the year, so that nothing spoiled and nothing ran out. The wool had to be cleaned, spun, woven and turned into the clothing, blankets and cloaks that dressed every single person under your roof, free and enslaved alike. The sick had to be tended. The enslaved staff had to be organised, assigned, watched and managed. The accounts had to balance. And the children, the future of the whole family line, had to be raised. She did or directed all of it. Weaving in particular sat at the very heart of the ideal wife's identity. It was so central that even goddesses and queens in the old stories are shown at the loom, and a woman's skill with wool was praised the way a man's skill in battle or debate might be. This was not a quaint hobby. The cloth the household produced had real economic value, and a wife who ran her looms well was, in a very concrete sense, generating wealth. She was simply never allowed to call it that. Then there is the matter of the dowry, which gave her a sliver of genuine leverage in a world that offered her almost none. When she married, her family sent a dowry along with her, and while you managed it, it was not truly yours to squander. If the marriage ended, that dowry was supposed to return with her. This meant a wife was not entirely powerless, because sending her away meant sending her wealth away too, and few men were eager to do that. It was thin protection, but in her position, thin protection was worth having. For all this responsibility, she remained, in the eyes of the law, a permanent minor. She could not vote, couldn't represent herself in serious legal matters, and always stood under the authority of a male guardian, first her father, then her husband. She had married young, likely in her mid-teens, to a man like you who was already well into adulthood, and she stepped into the role of chief executive of a complex household while still very nearly a child herself. So the next time you lounge on your couch praising your own good fortune, remember who actually keeps it running. And remember that somewhere in that busy, well-ordered house, a new life may already be beginning. Which brings us gently to the children. Now to a gentler and also darker corner of the house, the children. If you were wealthy, your children had wet nurses, tutors, toys, and a genuinely comfortable start in life. But the very beginning of that life was terrifyingly fragile. Infant mortality was brutal even for the rich, and a newborn was not truly welcomed into the family until a ceremony held several days after birth, once it seemed likely to actually survive. It is also true, and worth saying plainly and without dressing it up, that unwanted infants were sometimes abandoned, a practice the Greeks accepted with a coldness that is very hard to sit with today. So you cradle your surviving child, grateful and quietly aware that in this world, not even wealth could promise you a tomorrow. The rituals around a new baby tell you everything about how uncertain those first days were. A few days after birth came a ceremony in which the infant was carried swiftly around the household hearth, formally bringing it into the family and the protection of the home. Then, on the 10th day, came the naming celebration, with family gathered, gifts given, and the child at last given its name. The reason these moments waited was heartbreakingly practical. So many newborns did not survive their first week that families held back their full welcome and their full hearts, until the odds had improved even slightly. When a child did take hold of the life, a rich home was a soft place to land. There were wet nurses, often enslaved women or hired help, to feed and carry the baby. There were toys that would look familiar to any modern parent, rattles to shake, little clay dolls, small carts to pull, and the ever-present knuckle bones which children flung and caught in games of skill much like modern jacks. There were pets, indulgent grandparents, and, for a while at least, the simple freedom to be small. Wealthy Greek children were, by the standards of the age, rather doted upon. But we cannot walk past the hardest truth of this world, and it deserves to be spoken carefully rather than sensationally. Not every infant born was kept. A newborn that was unwanted or sickly, or arriving into a family that felt it already had too many mouths or too many daughters, might be exposed, left outside rather than raised. Some of these infants died. Some were taken up by strangers and raised, often into slavery. It was not universal, it was not without its critics even at the time, and many families never did such a thing at all. But it was legal, it happened, and the society tolerated it in a way that lands like a cold stone in the modern chest. We name it, we sit with it, and we do not pretend it away. For the children who were welcomed and who lived, the path ahead split sharply by whether they were a boy or a girl, and it split early. A daughter's world would fold inward, toward the household, toward weaving and managing and the same secluded life her mother led, and toward a marriage arranged while she was still very young. A son's world would open outward, toward tutors, the gymnasium, the assembly, the whole bright public life of a citizen. The same nursery, the same toys, the same doting relatives, and yet two utterly different futures already written before either child could walk. You watch your children play in the courtyard, safe and warm and lucky in ways most children of the city will never be, and you feel the particular tenderness of a parent in a dangerous age, loving fiercely precisely because nothing is guaranteed. And soon enough, for your son at least, the carefree years will end. It will be time to make him into a proper Athenian gentleman, and that is a project the Greeks took very seriously indeed. Assuming your son has made it through those precarious early years, it is time for the great project of turning him into a proper Athenian gentleman. A wealthy boy was handed over to a pedagogos, an enslaved man whose entire job was to walk him to his lessons, keep him out of trouble, and beat some manners into him along the way. He learned reading, writing, music on the lyre, and poetry recited until he could bleed Homer from memory, and eventually the crown jewel, rhetoric, the art of arguing so persuasively that you could be completely wrong and still win the room. Your daughter, meanwhile, learned to weave and to run a home. The Greeks called this a balanced education. We would call it something considerably less flattering. The first thing to understand is that there was no public school system paying for any of this. Education was private and it was purchased, which meant a proper education was one more thing that money bought and poverty denied. A rich boy got the full package. A poor boy got whatever scraps of learning his family could scrape together, if any. So even before your son opened a single book, his wealth had already sorted him into the fortunate few. His days were divided among a small team of teachers, each with a specialty. The grammatists handled letters, teaching him to read, to write with a pointed stylus on wax tablets that could be smoothed over and used again, and to do basic arithmetic, often by shuffling little pebbles around a counting board. Paper as you know it did not exist, and papyrus was costly, so the humble reusable wax tablet did the daily work, the ancient answer to a scratch pad. Then came the kitharists, the music teacher, because a cultivated Athenian was expected to play the lyre and sing. Music was not treated as a mere hobby, but as a core part of shaping a good character, harmonious and balanced, and a man who could not hold a tune at a dinner party was quietly judged for it. Alongside the music came poetry, and above all Homer. Your son would memorize vast stretches of the great epics, not simply as literature, but as a kind of moral and cultural Bible, a source of heroes to imitate, values to absorb, and phrases to quote for the rest of his life. The third teacher was the Paido-tribes, the physical trainer, who took the boy to the wrestling ground and drilled him in running, wrestling, jumping and throwing. A gentleman was meant to have a fit, capable, beautiful body as much as a sharp mind, and the two were considered part of the same education, not rivals for his time. A brilliant boy in a weak body was a job half finished. Through all of this loomed the pedagogos, who was not a teacher at all but a guardian and enforcer. He escorted the boy through the streets, protected him, supervised his behaviour, and corrected him, sometimes gently and sometimes with a stick. It is one of the great ironies of your world that the daily moral shaping of your precious freeborn son was entrusted to an enslaved man who owned nothing, not even himself. When your son grew older and showed promise, the truly ambitious families reached for the highest and most expensive teachers of all, the travelling masters of rhetoric and argument who charged enormous fees to sharpen a young man into a persuasive public speaker. In a city run by debate and of votes, the ability to argue was the ability to win, and it was worth every coin. Your daughter, of course, received none of this, only the domestic training that would prepare her for the secluded life ahead. 2 children, 1 household, and only one of them being handed the keys to the city. And speaking of the city, it is finally time to leave the house and step out into it. Enough lounging. It is time to step out into Athens itself, and the first thing that hits you is that being rich did not spare you from the city being an absolute mess. The streets are narrow, unpaved, winding, and gloriously filthy, because organised sanitation was more of a hopeful suggestion than an actual system. People tossed their waste more or less wherever it landed. Stray dogs patrolled the alleys with real authority, and the smell on a hot afternoon could knock a lesser man clean off his feet. You pick your way through in your fine sandals, cloak arranged just so, trying to look dignified while stepping over things you would very much rather not identify. The gleaming marble temples sit above it all on the Acropolis, magnificent and spotless, like a beautiful filter laid over a deeply unfiltered town. The old heart of Athens was never planned. It simply grew, house by house, generation by generation, into a tangle of cramped lanes that twisted, forked and doubled back with no logic whatsoever. There were no street signs, no straight avenues, and no numbers on the doors, so finding an unfamiliar house meant asking, guessing, and wandering. Interestingly, the Greeks knew perfectly well how to build a tidy grid, and did exactly that down in the port town below, where the streets ran neat and orderly by design. But the ancient core of the great city itself stayed a glorious medieval-feeling maze, and money could not buy you out of walking it. The filth was the great equalizer. With no proper drains or waste collection to speak of, the streets absorbed everything the households pushed out into them, and on a still summer day the air thickened into something you could almost lean against. Rain turned the lanes to sucking mud. Dry spells turned them to swirling dust. Animals wandered through, dogs everywhere, the occasional pig or donkey, all of them contributing enthusiastically to the general state of the ground. Your beautiful sandals and carefully draped hymation are, at this point, engaged in open warfare with the city itself. Scattered along your route stand the herms, and they are worth a mention, if only because they are so wonderfully strange. These were stone pillars topped with a head of the god Hermes, and further down, a carved set of, let us say, unmistakably male features, planted at doorways, boundaries, and crossroads as guardians of good luck and safe passage. To you they are utterly ordinary, as familiar as a mailbox, and you would no more comment on one than a modern person comments on a lamppost. To a visitor from another time, an entire city decorated with these cheerful stone sentinels takes a bit of getting used to. At the public fountain houses the streets came alive. These were the places where water was fetched, and since carrying water was work for women and the enslaved, the fountains became busy social crossroads, full of chatter, gossip, and the clatter of jars. For many secluded women, a trip to the fountain was one of the few sanctioned reasons to step outside, which turned a simple errand into something closer to a social event, brief and precious. And above all of it, always, sat the Acropolis. Lift your eyes from the muck at your feet, and there it was, the sacred rock crowned with dazzling temples of white marble, bright and clean and serene, watching over the grubby, noisy, thriving town below. It was the city's soul made visible, the answer to why anyone put up with the smell and the mud and the maze. You are rich, you are dressed, you are out in the world, and the world is loud, filthy, and utterly alive around you. Now there is only one question left. Where does a man like you actually go? And in Athens, nearly every road worth walking leads to the very same place. Your first real destination is the Agora, the beating heart of the city, part marketplace, part courthouse, and part social media feed made entirely of gossip. Here you can buy fish, pottery, perfume, and enslaved people, listen to a philosopher argue with a fishmonger, and catch up on every rumour worth knowing before the day is out. For a wealthy man, the Agora is less about shopping, which your staff can perfectly well handle, and far more about being seen, making connections, and gently reminding everyone that you exist and that you matter. You will stroll, you will chat, you will pretend not to be listening to 3 conversations at once. It is networking, ancient Greek style, and if you play it well, your reputation grows. If you play it badly, you become tomorrow's gossip. The Agora was a wide-open public square ringed with grand covered walkways called stoas, long colonnaded porches where people sheltered from the sun met their friends and conducted their business. One of the most famous, the painted stoa, was decorated with great scenes of legendary battles and became such a popular hangout that an entire school of philosophy took its name from the porch itself. You could not throw an olive pit in this place without hitting someone with an opinion and the leisure to share it at length. Everything happened here, all at once, in a glorious jumble. Merchants sold their wares from stalls grouped by trade, so the potters clustered together, the fishmongers together, the perfume sellers together, each corner with its own crowd and its own distinctive smell. Money changers sat at their tables weighing coins from a dozen cities. Foreign traders, the resident outsiders who did much of the city's commerce, haggled and shouted and closed deals. And threaded through all of it were the idlers, the news hunters, and the philosophers, none of whom appeared to be buying anything at all. For a man of your standing, though, there was a delicate trap in the marketplace, and it was this. Actually working with your hands, selling things, labouring for wages, was quietly looked down upon by the aristocracy. A gentleman was supposed to have his wealth work for him through land and property, not to be caught sweating behind a stall. So you come to the Agora to be present, to be greeted, to be important, while the vulgar business of actual buying is left to the enslaved and the hired. You're here to hold court, not to shop. The Agora was also the civic centre of the whole city, which meant it was where power lived. Nearby stood the council house where the governing council met, the courts where juries heard cases, and the offices of the officials who kept the machinery of the state turning. This blending of shopping and governing was no accident. In Athens, the ordinary citizen was meant to be knee-deep in both commerce and politics, and the Agora put them in the same square so a man could buy his dinner and reshape his city in a single morning. And the gossip, always the gossip. In a face-to-face world with no newspapers reaching most people and certainly no screens, the Agora was how news travelled, reputations were made and destroyed, and everyone kept tabs on everyone else. A wealthy man was a favourite subject, watched, discussed, envied, and picked apart. So you smile, you nod, you drop the right names to the right people, and you perform your own importance like the seasoned actor you have become. But there is one place in this square where the performance turns deadly serious, where being a rich citizen stops being a pleasure and becomes an obligation. It is time to talk about democracy. Here is the part of being a rich Athenian man that people love to romanticize and then quietly regret: democracy. As a citizen, you are not a spectator to your government, you are the government, and it is exhausting. Several times a month you're expected to trek up to the Nix Hill, stand in the sun with thousands of other men, and personally vote on war, taxes, law, and the occasional decision to exile someone simply because he had become annoyingly popular. There are no professional politicians in the way you understand them, and no representatives to handle the tedious part on your behalf. Skip out, and an enslaved public official might sweep the crowd with a rope dipped in red dye, and if it marked your cloak you could be fined. Civic duty with consequences and a laundry bill. Let us be clear about who counted as a citizen, because the club was small and the door was firmly shut. You had to be an adult male, born of the right parents, free and Athenian. Women, enslaved people, and the many resident foreigners who lived and worked in the city were all shut out entirely. So this famous democracy, this great experiment in rule by the people, was in truth ruled by a minority of men sitting on top of a much larger population that had no vote at all. The word people did a lot of quiet lifting. For those inside the club, though, the demands were genuine and relentless. The assembly, the great gathering of citizens, met dozens of times a year on that hillside. And there you did not simply choose leaders to decide things for you. You decided them yourself, in person, by a show of hands, alongside a crowd that could swell into the thousands. War and peace, treaties and taxes, the fate of generals, the spending of public money, all of it was argued in the open air and settled by the raw count of raised arms. Then there was the Council of 500, a body chosen mostly by lottery to prepare the business of the assembly and run the daily affairs of the city. Here is the detail that would horrify a modern politician. Many public offices were filled not by election but by drawing lots, on the theory that any decent citizen ought to be capable of serving, and that lottery kept ambitious men from simply buying their way into power. Ordinary tradesmen found themselves administering the state because a bean or a token had fallen their way. It was democracy taken almost gleefully to its logical extreme. And you served on juries too, enormous ones, hundreds of citizens deciding cases with no judge to guide them, and no lawyers as you know them, just the accused, the accuser, a water clock ticking down each speaker's time, and a mass of your fellow men holding your fate in their hands. Justice was loud, fast, and thoroughly amateur. For a rich man, all of this carried a special edge of danger. Wealth and prominence made you a target. Certain men made a living by threatening lawsuits against the wealthy, hoping to be paid off to go away. And a popular assembly in a bad mood could turn on a prosperous citizen with frightening speed. The very system that gave you a voice could, on the wrong day, vote to strip you of your money, your standing, or your place in the city altogether. So you climb the nicks, you raise your hand, you make your speeches, and you keep one wary eye on the crowd. Because here your fortune buys you influence, and paints a target on your back in the same breath. And when the long, tense business of governing is finally done for the day, you head somewhere far more pleasant, somewhere built entirely for men like you with time to spare. With your civic duty discharged, it is time for the true centre of an aristocrat's social life, the gymnasium. This was far more than a place to sweat. It was a sprawling complex where men exercised, bathed, debated philosophy, made business deals, and flirted shamelessly, all rolled into one gloriously leisurely institution. The great thinkers taught here, the celebrated young athletes trained here, and the whole thing functioned as a country club for citizens with time on their hands, which as a rich man is essentially your entire personality. You will run, wrestle, throw the discus, and then collapse into a shaded colonnade to discuss the true meaning of virtue with several other men who also conveniently do not have jobs. This is the good life, and you know it perfectly well. Athens boasted several of these grand complexes on the leafy outskirts of the city, set among trees and running water, where the air was cleaner and the surroundings pleasant. The most famous of them lent their names to ideas that would outlast the buildings by thousands of years, because one of these gymnasium grounds hosted the school of a certain famous philosopher, and another hosted his equally famous student. When you hear grand words for a great school of thought, remember that the roots of some of them are quite literally an athletic park where men went to work up a sweat and talk nonsense until it accidentally became wisdom. The heart of the complex was the wrestling ground, an open courtyard ringed with rooms where men trained under the eye of a coach. Around it spread changing rooms, oiling rooms, dusting rooms, washing areas, and shaded walkways for the essential business of standing about and talking. The physical training was real and demanding, running, wrestling, jumping, throwing the discus and the javelin, all the events a Greek admired, but the building was designed just as much for lounging as for labouring. Because here is the truth of it. For a wealthy man of leisure, the gymnasium was less a fitness centre and more a private club, the place where the important men of the city gathered every day to see and be seen. Business was arranged in its colonnades. Political alliances were struck between exercises. Reputations were built and demolished. If you wanted to know who mattered in Athens and what they were thinking, you did not read about it. You went to the gymnasium and joined the conversation, oiled and slightly out of breath. And then, of course, there was the thinking. These shaded grounds became the natural haunt of philosophers, because where else would you find a permanent crowd of educated, unhurried men with nothing pressing to do and a deep fondness for argument? Teachers strolled the walkways trailed by students. Questions were chewed over for hours, and some of the most important ideas in the history of human thought were first tossed around by men who had come, ostensibly, to work on their wrestling. It is a strange and rather wonderful thing when you sit with it. Body and mind were not treated as rivals here, but as partners, both to be trained, both to be perfected, in the same green and pleasant place. A cultivated Athenian gentleman was meant to be strong and clever, fit and wise, and the gymnasium was where he became both at once. So you arrive, you greet your peers, you prepare to train. But before you can begin, there is the small matter of the dress code, which is to say the complete and cheerful absence of one. Now, about the dress code at the gymnasium, there is not one. The word gymnasium itself comes from the Greek for naked, and the Greeks took that root extremely literally. Men exercise completely nude, glistening with olive oil, entirely unbothered, in a way that would get you swiftly arrested almost anywhere today. To them, the trained male body was a thing of genuine beauty, a favourite subject for sculptors, and a source of real civic pride. So parading it around while hurling a javelin felt perfectly natural. You strip down, oil up, and join in, trying very hard to behave as though this is all completely normal, because to everyone around you it genuinely is. The oil, the dust, the sun, and the sweat. You're going to need that strigil again very soon. To understand why an entire civilization decided that pants were optional at the gym, you have to understand how the Greeks felt about the human form. They did not regard a fit, healthy body as something to be hidden away in shame. They regarded it as an achievement, evidence of discipline, health, and good character made visible. A man who had trained his body into strength and grace had something worth displaying, and the gymnasium was the stage for it. The whole ritual had a rhythm to it. First you removed your clothing and set it aside. Then you rubbed yourself down with olive oil, worked into the skin until you shone, which was thought to warm the muscles, protect the skin, and simply look magnificent. Some then dusted a fine powder over the oil, giving a better grip for wrestling and a bit of a shield against the sun. By the time you stepped out to train, you were oiled, dusted, gleaming, and entirely in the buff, and so was every other man in the place, from the eager youth to the greying elder statesman. This is where those beautiful marble statues you may picture in a museum actually come from. Sculptors studied these training grounds obsessively, watching real bodies in motion, learning how muscle shifted and balance held, and then translating what they saw into stone. The famous, idealized athletes frozen mid-throw or mid-step were not invented from imagination. They were portraits of a culture that spent its afternoons watching the human body do impressive things in the open air. There was naturally a line drawn firmly around who got to be present for all this. The gymnasium was a male world, closed to respectable women as both athletes and onlookers. This was the domain of the citizen man, another of those spaces like the drinking party and the assembly, where the important business of male life was conducted well out of female sight. The women of your household were spinning wool upstairs while you and your peers threw the discus in the sunshine wearing nothing but a coat of oil. For all the strangeness of it to modern eyes, there was something almost innocent in the Greek attitude, a matter-of-fact ease with the body that later ages would lose entirely. Nakedness at the gymnasium was not shocking or shameful to them. It was simply the correct way to exercise, as unremarkable as putting on running shoes is to us. The strange part to them would be doing it any other way. So you train, you sweat, you shine, and by the end you are coated head to toe in a thick paste of oil, dust, and honest effort. Which leaves one obvious and pressing problem. All of that has to come off, and getting clean in the ancient world is nothing at all like turning on a tap. Speaking of which, all that oil and dust has to come off somehow, and this is where getting clean becomes an athletic event in its own right. There were public bathing basins at the gymnasium, but the real work was the scraping. You, or more likely an enslaved attendant, would drag the strigil across your skin, peeling away the mixture of oil, sweat and grime in long, satisfying, faintly revolting strips. Wealthy men prized this ritual enormously, and the scrapings of famous athletes were even collected and sold to admirers, because some things about human beings simply never change. A splash of cold water, a brisk rub down, and a fresh coat of perfumed oil, and you emerge clean, gleaming, and smelling once again of very expensive salad. You feel, frankly, magnificent. The strigil is the unsung hero of ancient hygiene, and it deserves a proper introduction. It was a curved blade of bronze or iron, shaped a little like a hook or a long comma, with a handle at one end and a smooth channel running down its length. You pressed the curve against your skin and drew it firmly along your arm, your leg, your back, and it ploughed up the oil and everything stuck in it, funneling the whole grim harvest off your body and onto the ground. Done well, it left you clean. Done badly, it left you scratched and grumpy. And here is the detail that never fails to astonish. The greasy, sweaty muck scraped off the bodies of famous athletes was not simply thrown away. It was collected, bottled, and sold, because people genuinely believed that the sweat and oil of a great champion carried healing or strengthening properties, useful as a medicine or an ointment. Somewhere in Athens, a wealthy man was rubbing the bottled residue of a celebrity wrestler onto a sore knee and paying good money for the privilege. The impulse to buy a piece of the famous is apparently older than we ever imagined. For the actual water part of getting clean, your options were humble. At the gymnasium and at home there were basins and troughs for splashing and rinsing, and the water was very often cold, because heating large quantities of it was a genuine labour. You did not luxuriate under a warm cascade. You doused yourself, scrubbed, and got on with it, more like rinsing off after a swim than soaking in a spa. Public bathhouses did exist in the city, warmer and more comfortable, offering heated water and a place to linger. But here your society sent mixed messages, because the more conservative voices regarded frequent hot bathing as a soft, self-indulgent habit, the sort of thing that made a man weak and unmanly. A true rugged Greek, they sniffed, made do with cold water, and did not lie about steaming himself like a pampered Easterner. Naturally, plenty of people enjoyed the warm baths anyway, and let the moralists complain into their cold basins. Once the scraping and rinsing were done, you sealed the whole ritual by anointing yourself all over again, this time with fresh, clean, perfumed oil. It moisturized the skin, guarded against the dry heat, and left you fragrant, and it neatly explains why the wealthy went through so much of the stuff. Oil was the beginning and the end of every wash, the ancient world's soap and lotion in one golden, slightly ridiculous package. So you finish clean, glowing, freshly scented, and quietly pleased with yourself. And now that your body's in perfect order, Your attention turns naturally to the surface of things, to appearance, to display, to the endless and very serious game of looking exactly as rich as you actually are. Feeling thoroughly refreshed, you now turn to the serious business of looking as rich as you actually are. For men this was a delicate game because Athens officially admired restraint and unofficially adored showing off. Your himation was of the finest wool, your sandals well made, and your beard carefully shaped, because a proper adult man wore a beard the way a modern executive wears an expensive watch. For the women of the household, the display went considerably further, with gold jewellery, elaborate earrings, intricate hairstyles, and cosmetics including a lead-based white powder for the skin that was fashionable, costly, and quietly poisonous. Beauty always had a price, and here that price was sometimes your health. Still, you look the part, and in this particular city, looking the part is very nearly half the battle. The trick for a wealthy man was to look magnificent while pretending you had barely tried. Athens prized the idea of moderation and viewed obvious extravagance in a man as vaguely distasteful, the mark of someone trying too hard or worse, someone new to money. So the display had to be quiet and knowing, not gaudy, but perfect. The wool of your cloak was simply the finest available. Your sandals were simply the best made. You carried yourself with the unhurried ease of a man who was never once worried about anything, and that studied ease was itself the most expensive thing you wore. A few small touches did the talking. A well-shaped beard signalled maturity and dignity. A good walking staff lent an air of authority. A signet ring carved with your own personal seal was both jewellery and tool, used to press your mark into wax and clay to seal letters and documents. A little emblem of a man important enough to have things worth sealing. These were the understated flourishes of male wealth, restrained on the surface and quietly boastful underneath. For the women of your house the rules relaxed and the display grew bolder, though of course it happened largely out of public view. Gold gleamed at the ear, the wrist, and the throat. Hair was oiled, curled, and arranged into elaborate styles with pins and bands, and the face received the full attention of ancient cosmetics, which is where things turned genuinely alarming. The prized look was pale skin, a sign that a woman did not toil outdoors in the sun like a common labourer, and to achieve it, women applied a white powder made with lead. It worked beautifully, and it was slowly toxic, seeping its poison into the very people trying hardest to be beautiful. Cheeks and lips were reddened with safer plant-based dyes. Brows were darkened and sometimes drawn together, since a single continuous brow was admired. Beauty, in other words, could quite literally cost a woman her health, one fashionable application at a time. Mirrors completed the ritual, though not the clear glass mirrors you know. These were discs of polished bronze, giving back a dim, golden, slightly forgiving reflection, which was perhaps a small mercy. A woman checked her elaborate handiwork in a soft blur of metal, seeing a gentler version of herself than a modern mirror would ever allow. Underneath all of it ran a single quiet truth. Every pin, every ring, every drop of perfume, every dangerous dab of white lead was a message, and the message was always the same. This household has money, and it is not afraid to show it, tastefully of course. Appearance here was not vanity for its own sake, it was reputation made visible. And speaking of appetites, both social and literal, all this preening has carried you toward the middle of the day, and a wealthy man does not skip his lunch. All this grooming and civic strolling has made you hungry, so let us talk about lunch, which the Greeks treated as a light and remarkably unfussy affair. Even in a rich household, the midday meal was simple: bread, olives, cheese, figs, perhaps some dried fish or a handful of vegetables, eaten without much ceremony at all. The Greeks genuinely admired moderation in food, at least in theory, and regarded gluttony as the unmistakable mark of a barbarian or a fool. Of course, theory and practice rarely shook hands, and the real indulgence was always saved for the evening. For now you eat lightly, virtuously, and with the smug inner satisfaction of a man who knows a much larger meal is coming later and fully intends to pretend otherwise. The foundation of the meal, as with nearly every meal, was bread, and everything else was arranged around it. The Greeks even had a way of thinking about food that split it neatly into two camps. There was the staple, the bread and grain that filled your belly and did the serious work of feeding you, and there was the relish, everything tasty that you ate on top of it or alongside it to make the bread interesting. The staple kept you alive, the relish kept you happy. And a great deal of Greek eating was really the art of finding a good relish to make the endless bread bearable. Your midday relishes were modest and familiar, the very things a modern doctor would applaud. Olives, glistening and salty. Cheese, often from goats or sheep. Figs, fresh in season, or dried the rest of the year. So beloved that Athenians were half convinced their figs were the best in the world, and said so at every opportunity. A little dried or salted fish, onions, garlic, and whatever vegetables the season offered, and to drink, wine, watered down, because it was midday and you were a civilized man. What you would not find at lunch, or at most meals, was a great slab of meat. Fresh meat was surprisingly rare in the daily Greek diet, and for most people it was tied to religious sacrifice, eaten mainly on festival days when animals were offered to the gods, and the meat shared out among the people afterward. Even for the wealthy, everyday dining leaned far more on bread, oil, wine, olives, and fish than on roasts and joints. The image of ancient banquets groaning under mountains of meat is more fantasy than fact, at least for ordinary days. The Greeks talked about their eating habits with a certain pride, contrasting their supposed simplicity and self-control with the imagined excess of foreign peoples, whom they loved to picture wallowing in luxury and losing themselves to appetite. To eat plainly and in moderation was, in the Greek telling, a sign of discipline and good character, proof that you mastered your desires rather than being ruled by them. It was a flattering story they told about themselves, and like most such stories it was true right up until dinner, because the moderation was, in large part, a daytime performance. The light breakfast, the modest lunch, the talk of self-control, all of it set the stage for the evening, when the wealthy gathered to eat well, drink deep, and indulge properly among friends. The restraint of the day was, in a sense, just making room for the pleasures of the night. So you finish your simple, sensible lunch, olives and bread and a splash of wine, the very picture of Greek moderation, and then, being rich, you begin to think about the evening, because a proper feast does not assemble itself. It is time to go shopping for the good stuff, and the good stuff is a world unto itself. Since your evening feast will not stock itself, let us wander through the world of luxury food, because this is where the rich truly separated themselves from everyone else. The great obsession was fish, specifically fine fresh fish, which was so prized and so expensive that a good catch arriving at market could very nearly cause a stampede. Wealthy Athenians competed over rare delicacies, imported eels, exotic seasonings, good honey, and wine from famous regions, the way modern people compete over impossible restaurant reservations. Your cook, most likely an enslaved specialist whose skill reflected directly on your own status, will turn these treasures into a meal designed purely to impress. You're not simply buying dinner tonight. you're buying the right to be talked about tomorrow. The fish obsession is not an exaggeration, and it is genuinely one of the strangest and most delightful things about your world. Fine, fresh fish was the ultimate luxury food, more coveted than almost any meat, and the Greeks had a word for the sort of man who spent recklessly and drooled shamelessly over it. A fish glutton, a man who lost all dignity at the sight of a good eel, was a stock figure of mockery in the comedies of the day. Poets and playwrights joked endlessly about wealthy men fighting over the best catch, bankrupting themselves for a particularly fine specimen, and hovering around the fish stalls like moths around a flame. The most legendary delicacy of all was the eel, especially the great fat eels from a famous lake to the north, praised by comic poets as though they were royalty. A truly fine eel was spoken of with reverence, wrapped in beet leaves, cooked with care, and served as the crowning glory of a feast. To set such a dish before your guests was to announce without a word that your household spared no expense and knew exactly what the finest things were. Beyond fish, the wealthy competed across a whole landscape of imported and rare goods. Honey, the great sweetener of a world without sugar, prized from certain regions above all others. Spices and seasonings carried in from distant lands, rich cheeses, choice cuts, rare fruits, and above all wine from the islands and coasts with the greatest reputations, whose names on a jar meant instant prestige. Where your food and drink came from mattered enormously, and a knowledgeable host chose his sources the way a collector chooses his treasures. Presiding over the transformation of these treasures was your cook, and in a grand household the cook was a figure of real importance. Often an enslaved specialist of considerable skill, sometimes hired out for great occasions, the celebrated cook could make or break a feast, and with it, a host's reputation. In the comedies of the age, cooks strut about as boastful geniuses, lecturing everyone on the philosophy of the perfect dish, absurdly proud and secretly indispensable. The joke worked because it held a truth. A rich man's glory at the table rested on the talent of a man he legally owned. And that is the quiet engine beneath all this abundance. Every rare fish, every pot of prized honey, every jar of famous wine was a form of communication, a message about who you were and how high you stood. The feast was never only about eating. It was about display, competition, and the endless jostling for status among men who had everything and wanted, always just a little more admiration than the man on the next couch. So your enslaved staff carry home the treasures of the market, and the kitchen begins to fill with the smells of the evening to come. But before we reach the party itself, there is one ingredient so central, so wrapped in ritual and rule, that it deserves a segment all its own. We need to talk about wine. Before the party can begin, we must discuss the single most important rule of Greek drinking, one they regarded as a mark of civilization itself. You do not drink your wine straight. Only barbarians, they insisted with great confidence, gulped down unmixed wine like animals at a trough. A civilized Greek mixed his wine with water in a large communal bowl called a crater, usually diluting it quite heavily, and drank it slowly across hours of good conversation. The goal was a pleasant, sociable warmth, not a blackout, though as the night wore on the mixtures did grow stronger and the debates grew louder. Getting the ratio wrong marked you as either a hopeless lightweight or a shameless lush. So you sip, you pace yourself, and you remember that the Greeks invented moderation and then immediately set about testing its limits. The crater sat at the very centre of the gathering, a wide-bellied bowl in which wine and water were blended before anyone drank a drop. From it, servers filled the drinking cups, so that everyone at the party drank from the same shared mixture of the same strength, in a kind of liquid equality. Nobody poured his own private measure. The whole room rose and fell together, one bowl at a time, which is a rather lovely way to run a party when you think about it. The dilution was serious and heavy by modern standards. Wine was routinely cut with a great deal more water than wine, often several parts water to a single part wine, so that what you drank was closer to a mild, flavoured refreshment than to a strong drink. To take your wine with only a little water was considered daring, and to take it with none at all was practically a confession that you had lost your grip on civilised behaviour. The Greeks genuinely believed that unmixed wine could drive a man to madness, and they told cautionary tales of famous men who had ruined themselves by drinking in the reckless foreign manner. Watching over the ratio was a figure of real authority for the evening, a master of the drinking chosen from among the guests to run the party. He decided how strong to make the mixtures, how quickly the cups came round, and how far the night should be allowed to go. Under a wise master, the evening stayed warm and witty. Under a reckless one, the mixtures crept stronger, and the party tipped toward chaos. He held the mood of the whole room in the tilt of a single bowl. The wine itself came in many grades, and a host's choice spoke volumes. The most admired came from certain islands and coasts whose names carried instant prestige, dark and sweet and prized above all others. Lesser wines filled ordinary cups on ordinary days. Some wine was flavoured with resin, herbs, honey, or seawater, tastes that ranged from the delightful to the frankly alarming to a modern palate. And because there was no way to keep wine perfectly, much of it was drunk young, sweet and strong. All the more reason to tame it with water before it tamed you. Above all, wine carried the presence of a god. It belonged to Dionysus, the deity of wine, revelry, and joyful loss of control, and to drink was, in a small way, to honour him. Before the serious drinking began, a little wine was poured out as an offering to the gods, a splash tipped from the cup in thanks and respect. Even your indulgence had its sacred side, its nod to the powers watching over the feast. So the crater is filled, the water is added, the god is honoured, and the cups begin their slow circuit of the room. Everything is now in place. The couches are ready, the wine is mixed, the night stretches ahead. It is time, at last, for the crown jewel of your entire glittering life. It is time for the symposium, and now the crown jewel of aristocratic life, the symposium. This was the exclusive after-dinner drinking party, held in a special room called the Andron, where men reclined on couches arranged along the walls, propped up on one elbow, and gave themselves over to wine, talk, and entertainment. Reclining to drink was itself a status symbol, a way of quietly announcing that you were far too refined to sit upright like a common labourer. The guests were all men. The mood ranged from lofty philosophy to absolute chaos depending entirely on the hour, and the whole evening followed customs as elaborate as any modern dinner party, only with far more wine and considerably fewer chairs. You take your assigned couch, you settle in, and you brace yourself for what is going to be a very long night. The evening came in 2 acts, and it is important to keep them straight. First came the meal itself, the eating, which was handled relatively briskly. Then, once the food was cleared away, the tables wiped, and the proper offerings made to the gods, came the drinking party, the symposium proper, which was the whole point of the exercise. The Greeks did not mix serious eating and serious drinking. They finished one and then devoted themselves fully to the other, like a good show with a clear intermission. The setting was that finest room in your house, the Andron, built for exactly this purpose. Couches lined the walls, usually an odd handful of them, each holding 1 or 2 reclining guests, arranged so that everyone could see and talk to everyone else. You lay on your left elbow, cup within reach, cushions at your back, in a posture that was comfortable, sociable, and pointedly aristocratic. Reclining to drink was a luxury borrowed from the East and embraced with enthusiasm, and it marked you as a man of leisure and refinement, someone who had never needed to eat standing up in his life. Ritual opened the proceedings. Garlands of flowers or leaves were passed around and worn on the head, perfumes were shared, and offerings of wine were poured out to the gods, with special honour to Dionysus, whose gift filled the great bowl at the centre. Songs might be sung in praise of the divine before the human business of the evening began. Only then, with the gods thanked and the mood set, did the master of the drinking take charge and the cups begin to move. What happened next depended entirely on the company and the hour. At its finest, the symposium was one of the great glories of Greek civilization, a gathering where the best minds of the city reclined together and talked, really talked, about love, justice, beauty, politics, and the meaning of a good life, the wine loosening tongues and sharpening wit in equal measure. Some of the most celebrated works of philosophy are built around exactly such an evening, a group of clever men passing ideas around the room along with the cup. This was conversation raised to an art form. At its other extreme, the same party could dissolve into glorious disorder as the mixtures grew stronger and the discipline slipped, ending in loud songs, wild games, and men stumbling out into the dark streets long after they should have gone home. Between those poles lay every possible shade of evening, and no one arriving at the start of a symposium could be entirely sure which kind of night lay ahead. What was certain was the company and its limits. This was a gathering of citizen men, your peers and your rivals, and the respectable women of the household were nowhere to be seen. Yet the room would not be empty of skill, of music, or of voices raised in performance, because a symposium was never simply men drinking in silence. It came with entertainment, and that entertainment is a world worth exploring all on its own. A symposium was not just drinking, it was a performance, and every guest was expected to contribute something. There were drinking games, the most famous being kottabos, in which pleasantly tipsy men flung the dregs of their wine at a target across the room, which is exactly as messy as it sounds, and was considered the absolute height of fun. There was music from hired performers, riddles, poetry recited from memory, and long winding debates about love, politics and virtue that could turn either brilliant or unbearable, depending on how many craters had already been drained. As the host, your job was to keep the wine flowing and the mood alive. As a guest, your job was to be clever, charming, and still upright by the end of it, mostly. Let us start with kottabos, because it may be the single most Greek game ever invented. Each drinker saved the last splash of wine in the bottom of his cup, then flung it, with a practised flick of the wrist, at a target set up across the room, often a little disc balanced on a stand that would clatter down with a satisfying ring when struck true. Men wagered on their aim, called out the names of those they favoured as they threw, and took the whole silly business remarkably seriously. It was darts, essentially, played with wine and terrible for the walls, and grown men prided themselves on their technique. Then there was the music, which filled the room from beginning to end. Performers were brought into play, most commonly the aulos, a piercing double-piped reed instrument, whose sound wound through every gathering, alongside the gentler notes of the lyre. These musicians and dancers were, for the most part, enslaved or hired entertainers, whose lives were far more precarious than anything the reclining guests would ever know. A hard truth sitting quietly beneath the festivity, and one worth remembering even as the party glitters. Their skill was real, their circumstances were not their own, and the room enjoyed the former while ignoring the latter. The guests themselves were performers too, and this is the part that surprises people. You were expected to sing. As the evening went on, a branch of myrtle might be passed from couch to couch, and whoever held it was to offer up a song, a scrap of verse, a clever saying, or a witty toast before passing it on. These drinking songs, short and sharp and often improvised, were a genuine art form, and a man who could not take his turn gracefully was quietly marked down as dull. Your education in poetry and music, all those hours memorizing Homer and learning the lyre as a boy, was for exactly this moment. Riddles and word games filled the gaps, sometimes playful, sometimes fiercely competitive. One man would pose a riddle or begin a line of verse, and the next was challenged to answer it, complete it, or cap it with something better, the whole table sharpening its wits against itself. To lose could mean a forfeit, often a comic one, drinking a cup down in one go, or performing some small foolishness for the amusement of the rest. It was learning and drinking and showing off, all braided into the same golden evening. And weaving through all of it was the talk, which was the true heart of the thing. Between the songs and the games and the flying wine, men argued and joked and philosophized, and on the best nights the conversation soared into something memorable. This was the whole promise of the symposium, that wine and wit and good company might, just occasionally, produce something close to wisdom. But the room held one more presence we have circled around and not yet named, the only women permitted at this feast of men, and they deserve our full attention. You may have noticed something curious about this party. There are no respectable women present, and yet there are women. These were the hetaerai, a class of educated, independent companions who attended symposia when wives and daughters could not and would not. Unlike most women in Athens, a hetaera could be witty, well-read, and musically trained, holding her own in conversation with powerful men in a society that otherwise granted women almost no public voice at all. Their lives were complicated and often precarious, and it would be dishonest to romanticize them. But within the narrow, wine-soaked world of the symposium, they were frequently the sharpest minds in the room. You may find, to your own quiet embarrassment, that the most interesting person at your party is the very woman your city refused to educate. To understand what a hetaera was, you have to understand the strange gap in the lives of Athenian men. Your wife was kept secluded, largely uneducated in the ways of public life, and firmly excluded from your dinner parties and your world of ideas. This left a peculiar hole. Men wanted female company that could not just be looked at but talked with, company that could match them in wit, discuss poetry, follow an argument, and hold a room. Since respectable society forbade this of wives and daughters, an entirely separate class of women arose to fill it. The hetaerai were companions in the fullest and most complicated sense, and they occupied a role with no clean modern equivalent. Some were highly cultivated, skilled in music and conversation, celebrated for their cleverness, and sought after by the most prominent men in the city. A few became genuinely famous, remembered by name for their wit, their beauty, or their influence over powerful figures, moving through circles that no ordinary Athenian woman could ever enter. In a world that silenced women almost entirely, a small number of them became legends precisely for having a voice. But it would be a serious mistake to paint this life as glamorous or free, and honesty demands we do not. These were women living outside the protection that marriage, however confining, offered other women, and their security depended entirely on their charm, their reputation, and the favour of men who could withdraw it at any time. Many did not choose the role, many more never escaped it, and the celebrated few stood atop a much larger number of women whose lives were simply hard and unremembered. The independence came at a steep and constant price. The deep irony of it all sits right at the centre of your society. Athens took its own daughters and wives and shut them away from education, from public conversation, from the life of the mind, insisting this was virtue. Then, Finding its dinner parties dull without a clever woman present, it turned to a separate class of women, allowed and even encouraged them to be witty and learned, and prized them for exactly the qualities it forbade everyone else. The city built a wall around female intelligence, and then paid to visit it on the other side. So as you recline at your symposium, listening to a hetera turn a phrase more neatly than any man at the table, you're watching the contradiction of your whole world made flesh. She is proof that the women of Athens could have been anything, given the chance, and proof of how firmly that chance was denied. It is a sobering thought to hold over a cup of watered wine, and it leads us naturally back to the woman waiting upstairs in your own home, and to how she came to be your wife in the first place. Let us rewind from the party to something you had remarkably little say in, your own marriage. Among the wealthy, marriage was a business arrangement between families, negotiated carefully for property, alliance, and legitimate heirs, with romance considered a pleasant bonus at best. Your bride was likely still a teenager while you were already a grown man. The match was arranged entirely by her father, and a dowry changed hands to seal the deal. It was entirely possible to meet your wife properly for the very first time at the wedding itself. The Greeks did not marry for love, they married for the oikos, the household and its future, and love, if it arrived at all, was expected to turn up quietly sometime after the paperwork was done. Romantic it was not. Efficient, unfortunately, it very much was. The whole affair began not with the couple, but with the men who controlled them. The real, binding moment of an Athenian marriage was a formal agreement between your father, or you yourself, and the father of the bride, a contract in which he pledged his daughter to you and named the dowry that would come with her. The bride was not present for this, was not consulted, and had no say in it whatsoever. In the eyes of the law, marriage began as a handshake between two men over a young woman's future. That dowry was the practical heart of the deal, and it mattered enormously. A father sent his daughter into marriage with a sum of money or property, and the size of it shaped everything. Her standing in your household, the prestige of the match, and the seriousness with which the whole arrangement was regarded. As we saw before, the dowry never quite became fully yours to spend freely, and if the marriage ended it was meant to return with her, which gave a wife a thin but real thread of security in a life otherwise short on protections. The age gap was stark and taken entirely for granted. A bride was often in her mid-teens, sometimes younger, while her husband was frequently around 30, an established man ready to run a household and start producing heirs. This was simply how it was done, justified by the belief that a young wife could be more easily guided into the ways of her new home. To modernize it is deeply uncomfortable, and it should be named as the historical reality it was rather than smoothed over, an arrangement built entirely around the household's needs and never the girls'. The wedding itself, at least, was a genuine celebration, rich with ritual and warmth in a way the cold contract was not. There were sacrifices and feasting, ritual baths, and the bride wearing a veil that concealed her. A great procession carried her from her father's house to yours, often by torchlight, with music and song and well-wishers, delivering her into her new life and her new home. A central, tender moment came with the unveiling, when the bride at last revealed her face to her husband, a small ceremony of its own that marked her passage from one household to another. And then it was done. A young woman had been moved, like a treasured possession with a price attached, from the world of her father to the world of her husband, to begin the secluded, laborious life of managing a home she'd not chosen with a man she barely knew. If tenderness grew between them over the years, and sometimes it truly did, it was a happy accident rather than the goal. The goal was always the household, its continuation, and its heirs. And a household's fortunes, the Greeks firmly believed, rested not only on good management but on staying firmly in the good graces of the gods. Between all the feasting and philosophizing, you must never forget the gods, because in Athens they were everywhere and they were watching closely. Religion was not a weekly appointment, it was woven into every single hour of the day. Your home had its own small altars and a sacred hearth, and you would pour libations of wine, offer little scraps of food, and murmur prayers before meals, journeys, and decisions both large and small. Keeping the household gods content was regarded as simple common sense, rather like maintaining good credit. Neglect them, and you were practically inviting disaster through the front door. Honour them, and life ran smoothly. So you tip a little wine onto the floor for the gods before you drink, a gesture so automatic that you barely notice you're doing it. Belief here is just good housekeeping. The very centre of your household religion was the hearth, the fire at the heart of the home, which was itself sacred to a goddess of the hearth, and treated with genuine reverence. That flame was more than a source of warmth and cooking. It was the living symbol of the family itself, and keeping it burning was a quiet daily act of devotion. When a new baby was welcomed by being carried around that fire, or a new bride was brought into its light, they were being joined not just to a family but to the sacred flame at its core. Different corners of the home fell under the protection of different divine guardians, and a careful household honoured them all. The god of the sky and of the whole household in his role as protector watched over the courtyard, where a small altar stood for offerings. In another aspect, as the guardian of the storeroom, that same great god looked after your stores of food and wine, the wealth that kept the household fed. To honour him there was, in a very practical sense, to pray over your pantry, asking that it stay full and your family never want. At the threshold and out in the street stood the herms, those stone pillars we met on your walk through the city, set at doorways as guardians against harm and bringers of good fortune. You would touch them, tend them, and treat them with respect as you came and went, and to damage one was a grave and frightening act. Guarding the boundary between your home and the dangerous world outside was serious spiritual business, and the little stone sentinels did that work. The daily practice of all this was gentle and constant rather than grand. A splash of wine tipped from the cup before drinking, offered to the gods as their share. A few crumbs or first morsels of a meal set aside. A murmured prayer before setting out on a journey or beginning something important. Small offerings at the household altars. None of it was dramatic, and most of it was so habitual that you performed the gestures without a thought, the way a modern person might knock on wood or make a wish without truly deciding to. Underlying every bit of it was a worldview in which the divine and the everyday were not separate realms at all. The gods were not distant beings visited only at temples on special days. They were present in your fire, your storeroom, your doorway, your cup, woven into the fabric of ordinary life and interested, you believed, in whether you remembered them. To live piously was not a burden, but simply to live correctly, tending your relationship with the powers that governed everything. And if the small gods of the household deserved this daily care, the great gods of the whole city demanded something far larger and far more spectacular. For that, ordinary life stopped altogether, and the entire city poured into the streets. If you ever feel your calendar is too full, take some comfort, because the Athenian one was worse, absolutely stuffed with religious festivals that devoured a staggering portion of the year. There were dozens of them, ranging from the deeply solemn to the openly riotous, and as a wealthy citizen you were expected to show up, participate, and often help pay for the spectacle. The greatest was the Panathenaia, a grand procession up to the Acropolis in honour of the city's patron goddess, and the city Dionysia, a festival of theatre and wine in honour of Dionysus that shut down ordinary business entirely. Festivals meant sacrifices, feasting, competitions, and rare public appearances by the women of the city. They were holy, they were joyful, and they were, ever so conveniently, an excellent excuse to not do any work at all. The sheer number of them is hard to overstate. A remarkable share of the days in the Athenian year were given over to one religious observance or another, so many that the city seemed forever to be gearing up for a festival in the middle of one or recovering from the last. For all their talk of hard work and discipline, the Athenians built themselves a calendar with an astonishing amount of sacred holiday baked directly into it, and nobody was expected to labour while the gods were being honoured. The crown of them all was the great festival for the city's patron goddess, and every fourth year it swelled into an especially magnificent version. Its centrepiece was an enormous procession that wound through the city and up the sacred rock of the Acropolis, carrying a newly woven robe as a gift for the goddess, along with sacrificial animals, offerings, and what felt like the entire population in their finest. It was the city putting itself on display before its protector, a spectacle of civic pride, and taking part was both a duty and an honour. Sacrifice sat at the heart of nearly every festival, and it came with a very practical upside. Animals were offered to the gods on the great altars, and after the divine portion was burned, the meat was distributed and feasted upon by the people. In a world where fresh meat was a rare luxury on ordinary days, festival days were when ordinary Athenians actually got to eat it, courtesy of the gods and, quite often, courtesy of wealthy men footing the bill. Piety and a good meal arrived hand in hand. Festivals were also one of the few times the secluded women of the city stepped fully into public life, and for some celebrations they took centre stage. Certain festivals were led by women, or reserved for them, giving them a rare and sanctioned role in the great public rituals of the community. For women whose daily lives were spent indoors and out of sight, these sacred days were a genuine release, a legitimate reason to gather, to be seen, and to matter in the open air. And for a man of your wealth, the festivals carried a particular expectation, because someone had to pay for all this splendour, and that someone was often you. The richest citizens were called upon to fund the grand public celebrations, the choruses, the processions, the productions, turning private fortune into civic glory. It was expensive, it was a genuine burden, and it was also a magnificent opportunity to be admired, which is a tension we will return to shortly. For now, one festival in particular deserves its own moment, because from it grew one of the greatest gifts your civilization ever gave the world. It is time to go to the theatre. One of the finest things your crowded festival calendar offers is the theatre, and attending it was practically a civic duty dressed up as a delightful day off. You would file into a great open-air stone theatre alongside thousands of other citizens at dawn, and watch play after play unfold across an entire day, tragedies that gutted you completely, and comedies that mocked absolutely everyone, including the powerful men seated in the front rows. The actors wore masks and elaborate costumes. All the roles were played by men, and the greatest playwrights competed fiercely for prizes, while the crowd reacted with the raw enthusiasm of a modern sports arena. As a wealthy man, you might even have helped fund one of the productions, a costly honour that brought you both prestige and a very good seat. You settle in for the long haul. It is going to be a very full day. The theatre itself was a marvel, a vast bowl of tiered stone seating carved into a hillside below the Acropolis, open to the sky and capable of holding a crowd that ran into the many thousands. Down at the bottom lay the round dancing floor where the chorus performed, and behind it the structure that served as backdrop and changing space. The acoustics were extraordinary, engineered so that a voice from the floor could carry clearly to the highest, farthest seats a piece of ancient design that still astonishes visitors today. Going to the theatre was not the quiet, evening entertainment you might imagine. It was a mass public event tied to the festival of Dionysus, lasting from morning to evening across several days, with the whole city effectively on holiday to attend. You watched a sequence of plays in a single sitting, tragedies performed one after another, and comedies rounding things off. A full day's immersion in drama that would exhaust a modern audience, but which the Athenians embraced as a highlight of their year. The staging followed strict and fascinating conventions. Every performer was male, playing men and women alike, and every one of them wore a mask, large and expressive, that told the audience at a glance who they were and what they felt. A small number of actors, switching masks and costumes, played all the speaking roles between them, while a chorus sang, chanted and danced as a kind of collective voice, commenting on the action and drawing the audience into it. There were no elaborate special effects, only words, music, movement, and the powerful simplicity of the mask. It was, at its core, a competition, and the Athenians would not have had it any other way. Playwrights submitted their works to compete for prizes, judged before the whole city, and to win was a tremendous honour, while to lose stung deeply. The greatest dramatists of the age battled for these crowns, and the plays that survived to move audiences thousands of years later were first performed by men desperate to beat their rivals in front of a hometown crowd. Great art and fierce sport were, here, the very same thing. And once again, wealth and civic life were tangled together, because a rich citizen was often the one who paid for a production. Funding a chorus, its training, its costumes, and its expenses was one of the great public duties laid upon the wealthy. An enormous expense that also brought enormous prestige if your play took the prize. Your money could quite literally buy a share in immortal art, along with the admiration of the entire city. So you take your fine seat, the sun climbs, the first mask appears on the floor far below, and you give yourself over to a full day of the greatest drama the world had yet produced. But even the richest, most cultured life eventually meets a limit that no fortune can buy its way past. Sooner or later, you're going to get sick. Sooner or later, even the filthy rich fall ill, and here the ancient world becomes genuinely nerve-wracking. Greek medicine was, for its time, remarkably thoughtful, and physicians in the tradition of Hippocrates actually looked for natural causes of disease rather than simply blaming angry gods, which was a real leap forward. Unfortunately, their leading theory held that health depended on a balance of 4 bodily fluids. The humours and treatment often meant special diets, rest, purging, or simply waiting and hoping. There were no antibiotics, no reliable surgery, and no understanding of infection. Being wealthy bought you the best doctor available and a clean, comfortable place to be sick, which mattered, but it could not buy you a cure that did not yet exist. You could afford everything except certainty. The great leap of Greek medicine, and it truly was a leap, was the idea that illness had natural causes that could be observed, understood, and treated, rather than being simply the punishment of an offended god. Physicians began watching their patients closely, noting symptoms, tracking how a sickness progressed, and trying to predict its course. This careful observation, this insistence on looking at the body rather than only at the heavens, laid the foundations for everything medicine would one day become. For the ancient world, it was genuinely revolutionary. The trouble was the theory they built on top of those good instincts. The leading idea held that the body contained 4 essential fluids, and that health was simply a matter of keeping them in balance, while illness meant one of them had run to excess or fallen short. It was elegant, logical, and almost entirely wrong. but it dominated medical thinking for an astonishingly long time. Treatment therefore aimed at restoring the balance, which is where things got unpleasant for the patient. To rebalance those fluids, a physician might prescribe changes in diet, rest, and lifestyle, which was often harmless and sometimes genuinely helpful. But he might also turn to purging, sweating, and other methods of forcing the supposed excess out of the body, treatments that ranged from useless to actively harmful. For many conditions, the honest truth is that the best a doctor could do was ease the patient's comfort, offer sensible advice about rest and food, and wait to see whether the body would heal itself. Sometimes it did, sometimes it very much did not. The hard limits were stark. There were no antibiotics, so an infection that would be trivial to treat today could turn deadly. Surgery was crude, agonizing, and enormously risky, with no true understanding of how wounds became infected and no way to reliably prevent it. A broken bone, a bad wound, a fever that would not break, any of these could kill, and there was little a physician could do but try and hope and prepare the family for the worst. When earthly medicine failed, many turned to the divine, and here the old gods returned. The sick would travel to the sacred healing sanctuaries of the god of medicine, where they would sleep in the holy precinct, hoping the god would visit them in a dream and either cure them or reveal the remedy. It blended faith, rest, and the powerful comfort of hope, and the walls of these places were hung with offerings from those who believed they had been healed. When the doctors ran out of answers, the gods were where you went next. For all your wealth, this is the one arena where money reached its limit. It bought you the finest physician, the cleanest room, the most attentive care, and the best odds available, and those things were not nothing. But it could not buy a cure that had not been discovered, and in the end the rich man and the poor man faced the same fevers with the same uncertainty. Which raises the question you have spent this whole luxurious day avoiding. All this wealth, all this comfort, where did it actually come from? Now for the question you have politely avoided all day. Where does all this money actually come from? The answer is not glamorous. A great deal of Athenian wealth flowed from land, from trade across the Mediterranean, and above all from silver, dug out of the mines at Laurion by enslaved people, working in conditions so brutal that few survived them for long. The comfortable life you have enjoyed since dawn, the oil, the wine, the couches, the leisure, was underwritten by suffering you would never have to witness. Wealthy families also invested in workshops, real estate, and shipping, but the foundation stone of it all was human labour that received nothing in return. It is a beautiful life you lead. It simply was not built by you, and it was not built kindly. Land was the oldest and most respectable source of wealth. The kind an aristocrat was proud to name. Owning estates in the countryside, worked by enslaved labourers and tenant farmers, brought in grain, olives, wine, and the produce that fed a household and filled a fortune. To live off your land was considered the honourable way to be rich, clean, and dignified, the wealth of a gentleman rather than a grubby merchant. Much of the old money of Athens sat comfortably on inherited fields. Trade, though often looked down upon by the snobbish, was where fortunes could genuinely be made, because Athens sat at the heart of a web of sea routes, reaching across the whole known world. Ships carried its pottery, its oil and its silver outward, and brought back grain, timber, luxuries, and goods from every direction. Financing these voyages, investing in cargoes, and lending money to the merchants who sailed was a path to real riches, one many a wealthy Athenian quietly walked even while pretending his money all came from his ancestral farm. But the true engine, the source that made Athens not merely comfortable but powerful, was silver, and this is where the story turns dark. The city sat near rich veins of silver ore, and the mines that tapped them produced the wealth that built the fleet, funded the wars, and underwrote the golden age you're living in. That silver didn't lift itself out of the earth. It was extracted by enslaved people, thousands upon thousands of them, labouring in cramped, choking, lightless tunnels in conditions so severe that it was for many effectively a death sentence carried out slowly underground. This is the part of your world that must not be smoothed over. The leisure you have enjoyed all day, every hour of ease, every fine thing, rested on a foundation of human suffering deliberately kept out of your sight, worked by people whose names no one recorded and whose deaths no one mourned. The gleaming, cultured, philosophical Athens that the world would remember and admire was powered, in large part, by a system of brutal forced labour that its beneficiaries preferred not to think about. Both things are true at once, and honesty requires holding them together. Wealthy families spread their money across all of it, land and trade and silver and lending, along with workshops staffed by enslaved craftsmen turning out pottery, weapons, furniture, and goods for sale. Diversification is not a modern invention. A shrewd rich Athenian kept his fortune flowing through many channels at once, and most of those channels at some point ran through the labour of people who were owned rather than paid. So there is your answer, and it is not a comfortable one. You did not build this. You inherited it, invested it, and enjoyed it, and it was raised on the backs of the unfree and the unseen. And having a great fortune in Athens came with one more surprise that even you might not expect, because the city had very particular ideas about what a rich man owed it in return. Being rich in Athens came with a bill, and it arrived in the form of the liturgy, a system that was either noble civic generosity or a very fancy tax, depending on how you felt that year. Rather than a modern income tax, the city expected its wealthiest men to personally fund essential public expenses, such as staging a festival play, or the big one, equipping and maintaining a trireme, a warship for a full year of naval service. This was staggeringly expensive, and men competed to do it lavishly because paying up brought enormous prestige, while dodging it brought lasting shame. On top of that, if war came, you were expected to armour yourself and fight as a hoplite in the front lines. Wealth here did not exempt you from duty. It practically enlisted you. The logic of the system was strange to modernise, but oddly effective. Instead of collecting a broad regular tax and then deciding how to spend it, the city simply pointed at its richest citizens and assigned them specific public expenses to cover out of their own pockets. You were not asked to contribute to a general fund. You were told that this year you personally would be paying for that particular thing in full, and you were expected to do it well. The lighter version funded the great festivals, and it was expensive enough. Sponsoring a chorus for the theatre meant paying to recruit, train, costume, and support the performers for a dramatic production, bearing the whole cost of putting a play before the city. It could ruin a careless man financially, but it could also make his name, because if the production he funded won its competition, the glory reflected directly onto him. Your money bought art, and the art bought you fame. The heavy version funded the navy, and it was in a different league entirely. The most demanding duty of all was to take responsibility for a warship, one of the swift-oared vessels that made Athens the master of the sea, and to keep it equipped, maintained, and seaworthy for a full year of service. This meant covering repairs, gear, and countless expenses, and often taking a hand in commanding the vessel yourself. It was a colossal burden, the kind that could genuinely dent even a great fortune, and it fell on the wealthiest shoulders in the city. Yet here is the fascinating part. Men competed to do these things. and to do them more splendidly than their rivals. Discharging a great public duty lavishly was one of the surest ways to win the admiration and gratitude of your fellow citizens, to build a reputation for generosity and patriotism that paid off in influence, goodwill, and protection when you needed it. To be stingy or to dodge your obligation was to invite contempt. So the rich spent and spent grandly, turning taxation into a strange sort of status competition. The city even built in a clever check against cheating. If you were assigned an expensive duty and believed another man was richer and better able to afford it, you could challenge him, demanding either that he take on the burden instead or that the two of you swap entire estates. This ingenious and slightly mad arrangement made it very risky to pretend you were poorer than you were, since crying poverty could cost you your whole fortune in an exchange. And beyond all of this lay the oldest obligation of the wealthy citizen to fight. The men who could afford armour and weapons formed the heavy infantry, standing shoulder to shoulder in the battle line when the city went to war, which it often did. Your wealth did not keep you safely at home. It put you, armoured and expected, in the front rank. In Athens, the price of a great fortune was a great deal of giving it back, in money and, when required, in blood. And there is one final duty that comes for every man, rich or poor, that no fortune escapes and no liturgy covers. And so we come to the end, both of your very long day and eventually of your very fortunate life, because even the filthy rich must someday meet the same fate as everyone else. When a wealthy Athenian died, the send-off was elaborate. The body was washed, anointed with oil, dressed, and laid out at home for mourning, where the women of the family led loud, formal lamentations. Then came a procession to the burial site, and offerings to sustain the soul on its journey to the underworld, ferried, so the stories went, across a dark river by a boatman who expected to be paid. Grand tombs and carved monuments marked the resting places of the rich, ensuring that even in death the wealthy remained impossible to ignore. You lived in comfort, and you will be buried in style, which in Athens was rather the whole idea. The rituals of death unfolded in careful stages, and the women of the household led the first of them. The body was washed with care, anointed with oil, wrapped, and laid out on a bier within the home so that family and friends could come to mourn. Around it, the women of the family raised their voices in formal lamentation, weeping, wailing, singing dirges, and tearing at their hair in a display of grief that was expected, ritualized, and deeply serious. Mourning was work, and it was work that fell to women. Before dawn, the procession carried the dead from the house to the place of burial, a solemn parade through the still, dark streets, with the body borne along and the mourners following behind. The body might then be buried whole or cremated on a pyre, both practices being used, with the ashes gathered into an urn. Either way, the dead were laid finally to rest beyond the edge of the living city, in the burial grounds that lined the roads leading out of town. The Greeks believed the soul did not simply vanish, but journeyed onward to the underworld, and the dead were sent off equipped for that passage. Offerings were placed with the body, and there was the famous small coin set with the dead to pay the grim ferryman who carried souls across the dark river, dividing the living world from the land of the dead. To be buried without the proper rites was a genuine horror, leaving the soul to wander, unable to complete its journey, which is why giving the dead their due was among the most sacred of all obligations. For the wealthy, death was also, inevitably, one last chance for display. The rich raised grand tombs and carved stone monuments over their dead, sculpted markers showing the departed in dignified scenes, often surrounded by family, gazing calmly out across the centuries. These beautiful memorials lining the roads out of the city were both genuine tributes to the dead and quiet advertisements of the family's wealth and standing. Even in the grave, the aristocracy found a way to be seen. In fact, the displays of grief and monument grew so competitive and extravagant that at one point the city stepped in to rein them in, placing limits on how elaborate funerals could be and how dramatically the women could mourn. When even your grief and your tombstones become a form of showing off, a society may eventually decide that enough is quite enough. The impulse to turn everything, even death, into a contest of status was apparently difficult for the wealthy to resist, and so your day and your life comes gently to its close. You lived in a fine house built around a sunlit courtyard, waited on from dawn to dusk, draped in perfumed cloth, fed on rare fish and famous wine, schooled in poetry and rhetoric, honoured at festivals, and buried at last beneath a proud stone monument on the road out of the city you helped to rule. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary life, and yet as the lamps burn low and the long night settles over ancient Athens, it is worth pausing to think about what that glittering life truly rested upon, and about all the people who made it possible and were never once allowed to share in it. So there it is, a single day among the filthy rich of ancient Greece. You woke on a leather-strung bed, scraped yourself clean with a curved bronze blade, draped yourself in a perfumed cloth, and drifted through the marketplace, the gymnasium, and the drinking couch, wanting for almost nothing at all. By the measure of the ancient world, it was a life of extraordinary comfort, the kind most people who ever lived could only dream of, and still, as we followed it hour by hour, the same quiet truth kept rising to the surface. Your wine was watered, your teeth were rotting, your medicine was made mostly of hope, and beneath all the marble and the leisure lay a whole hidden world of people who made that comfort possible and were never once allowed to share in it. So tonight spare a gentle thought not just for the wealthy few who reclined on their couches, but for the many who quietly held the whole beautiful thing up, the women who ran the households in silence, the tutors, cooks, and nurses who shaped lives that were not their own, and the countless unnamed people labouring in the dark of the mines who built a golden age they would never taste. Their endurance, unrecorded and unthanked, is stitched invisibly into everything that world became. And when you settle now into your own soft bed, with warm water waiting behind a tap, with medicine that truly heals, and a home that is entirely wonderfully your own, let yourself feel just how remarkable that quietly is. No one drew your bath by hand. No one suffered in the dark so your light could glow. These small comforts, so easy to forget, would have been the envy of emperors and aristocrats alike. So rest now. Let the marble city fade. Let the lamps burn low, and drift off knowing you have lived a whole ancient day and found your way safely home. Sleep